What is popular poetry? I think it was a young island society that set my mind running on popular poetry. We used to discuss everything that was known to us about Ireland, and especially Irish literature and Irish history. We had no Gaelic, but paid great honour to the Irish poets who wrote in English and quoted them in our speeches. I could have told you at that time the dates of the birth and the death, and quoted the chief poems of men whose names you have not heard, and perhaps of some whose names I have forgotten. I knew in my heart that the most of them wrote badly, and yet such romance clung about them, such a desire for Irish poetry was in all our minds, that I kept on saying, not only to others but to myself, that most of them wrote well, or all but well. I had read Shelley and Spenser, and had tried to mix their styles together in a pastoral play which I have not come to dislike much. And yet I do not think Shelley or Spenser ever moved me as did these poets. I thought one day, I can remember the very day when I thought it, if somebody could make a style which would not be an English style, and yet would be musical and full of colour, many others would catch fire from him, and we would have a really great school of ballad poetry in Ireland. If these poets, who have never ceased to fill the newspapers and the ballad books with their verses, had a good tradition, they would write beautifully and move everybody as they move me. Then, a little later on, I thought, if they had something else to write about besides political opinions, if more of them would write about the beliefs of the people like Ellingham, or about old legends like Ferguson, they would find it easier to get a style. Then, with a deliberateness that still surprises me, for in my heart of hearts I have never been quite certain that one should be more than an artist, that even patriotism is more than an impure desire in an artist, I set to work to find a style, and things to write about, that the ballad writers might be the better. They are no better, I think, and my desire to make them so was, it may be, one of the illusions nature holds before one, because she knows that the gifts she has to give are not worth troubling about. It is for her sake that we must stir ourselves, but we would not trouble to get out of bed in the morning, or to leave our chairs, once we are in them, if she had not her conjuring bag. She wanted a few verses from me, and because it would not have seemed worthwhile taking so much trouble to see my books lie on a few drawing-room tables, she filled my head with thoughts of making a whole literature, and plucked me out of the Dublin art schools, where I should have stayed drawing from the round, and sent me into a library to read bad translations from the Irish, and at last down into Connaught to sit by turf fires. I wanted to write popular poetry like those Irish poets, for I believed that all good literatures were popular, and even cherished the fancy that the Adelphi melodrama, which I had never seen, might be good literature. And I hated what I called the coteries. I thought that one must write without care, for that was of the coteries, but with a gusty energy that would put all straight if it came out of the right heart. I had a conviction, which indeed I have still, that one's verses should hold, as in a mirror, the colours of one's own climate and scenery in their right proportion. And when I found my verses too full of the reds and yellows Shelley gathered in Italy, I thought for 2 days of setting things right, not as I should now by making my rhythms faint and nervous and filling my images with a certain coldness, a certain wintry wildness, but by eating little and sleeping upon a board. I felt indignant with Matthew Arnold because he complained that somebody who had translated Homer into a ballad measure had tried to write epic to the tune of Yankee Doodle. It seemed to me that it did not matter what tune one wrote to, so long as that gusty energy came often enough and strongly enough. And I delighted in Victor Hugo's book upon Shakespeare because he abused critics and coteries and thought that Shakespeare wrote without care or premeditation and to please everybody. I would indeed have had every illusion had I believed in that straightforward logic, as of newspaper articles, which so tickles the ears of the shopkeepers. But I always knew that the line of nature is crooked, that though we dig the canal beds as straight as we can, the rivers run hither and thither in their wildness. From that day to this, I have been busy among the verses and stories that the people make for themselves, but I had been busy a very little while before I knew that what we call popular poetry never came from the people at all. Longfellow and Campbell and Mrs. Hemans and Macaulay in his lays and Scott in his longer poems are the poets of the middle class, of people who have unlearned the unwritten tradition which binds the unlettered, so long as they are masters of themselves, to the beginning of time and to the foundation of the world, and who have not learned the written tradition which has been established upon the unwritten. I became certain that Burns, whose greatness has been used to justify the littleness of others, was in part a poet of the middle class, because though the farmers he sprang from and lived among had been able to create a little tradition of their own, less a tradition of ideas than of speech, they had been divided by religious and political changes from the images and emotions which had once carried their memories backward thousands of years. Despite his expressive speech, which sets him above all other popular poets, he has the triviality of emotion, the poverty of ideas, the imperfect sense of beauty of a poetry whose most typical expression is in Longfellow. Longfellow has his popularity in the main, because he tells his stories or his idea so that one needs nothing but his verses to understand it. No words of his borrow their beauty from those that used them before, and one can get all that there is in story and idea without seeing them. As if moving before a half-faded curtain embroidered with kings and queens, their loves and battles and their days out hunting, or else with holy letters and images of so great antiquity that nobody can tell the god or goddess they would commend to an unfading memory. Poetry that is not popular poetry presupposes, indeed, more than it says, though we, who cannot know what it is to be disinherited, only understand how much more when we read it in its most typical expressions, in the Epipsychidion of Shelley, or in Spenser's description of the gardens of Adonis, or when we meet the misunderstandings of others. Go down into the street and read to your baker or your candlestick maker any poem which is not popular poetry. I have heard a baker, who was clever enough with his oven, deny that Tennyson could have known what he was writing when he wrote, "Warming his 5 wits, the white owl in the belfry sits." And once, when I read out Omar Khayyam to one of the best of candlestick makers, he said, "What is the meaning of 'we come like water and like wind we go'?" Or go down into the street with some thought whose bare meaning must be plain to everybody. Take with you Ben Jonson's "Beauty like sorrow dwelleth everywhere," and find out how utterly its enchantment depends on an association of beauty with sorrow, which written tradition has from the unwritten, which had it in turn from ancient religion. Or take with you these lines in whose bare meaning also there is nothing to stumble over, and find out what men lose who are not in love with Helen. Brightness falls from the air, queens have died young and fair, dust hath closed Helen's eye. I pick my examples at random, for I am writing where I have no books to turn the pages of, but one need not go east of the sun or west of the moon in so simple a matter. On the other hand, when Walt Whitman writes in seeming defiance of tradition, he needs tradition for his protection, for the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker grow merry over him when they meet his work by chance. Nature, which cannot endure emptiness, has made them gather conventions which cannot disguise their low birth, though they copy, as from far off, the dress and manners of the well-bred and the well-born. The gatherers mock all expression that is wholly unlike their own, just as little boys in the street mock at strangely dressed people and at old men who talk to themselves. There is only one kind of good poetry, for the poetry of the coteries, which presupposes the written tradition, does not differ in kind from the true poetry of the people, which presupposes the unwritten tradition. Both are alike strange and obscure, and unreal to all who have not understanding, and both, instead of that manifest logic, that clear rhetoric of the popular poetry, glimmer with thoughts and images whose ancestors were stout and wise, anigh to paradise, ere yet men knew the gift of corn. It may be that we know as little of their descent as men knew of the man born to be a king when they found him in that cradle marked with the red lion crest, and yet we know somewhere in the heart that they have been sung in temples, in ladies' chambers, and our nerves quiver with the recognition they were shaped to by 1,000 emotions. If men did not remember or half remember impossible things, and, it may be, if the worship of sun and moon had not left a faint reverence behind it, what Aaron Fisher girl would sing, "It is late last night, the dog was speaking of you, the snipe was speaking of you in her deep marsh. It is you are the lonely bird throughout the woods, and that you may be without a mate until you find me. You promised me, and you said a lie to me, that you would be before me where the sheep are flocked. I gave a whistle and 300 cries to you, and I found nothing there but a bleating lamb. You promised me a thing that was hard for you, a ship of gold under a silver mast, 12 towns and a market in all of them, and a fine white court by the side of the sea. You promised me a thing that is not possible, that you would give me gloves of the skin of a fish, that you would give me shoes of the skin of a bird, and a suit of the dearest silk in Ireland. My mother said to me not to be talking with you today or tomorrow or on Sunday. It was a bad time she took for telling me that. It was shutting the door after the house was robbed. You have taken the east from me. You have taken the west from me. You have taken what is before me and what is behind me. You have taken the moon. You have taken the sun from me, and my fear is great, and you have taken God from me." The Gael of the Scottish Islands could not sing his beautiful song over a bride had he not a memory of the belief that Christ was the only man who measured 6 feet, and not a little more or less, and was perfectly shaped in all other ways, and if he did not remember old symbolical observances. I bathe thy palms in showers of wine, in the cleansing fire, in the juice of raspberries, in the milk of honey. Thou art the joy of all joyous things. Thou art the light of the beam of the sun. Thou art the door of the chief of hospitality. Thou art the surpassing pilot star. Thou art the step of the deer of the hill. Thou art the step of the horse of the plain. Thou art the grace of the sun rising. Thou art the loveliness of all lovely desires. The lovely likeness of the Lord is in thy pure face, the loveliest likeness that was upon earth. I soon learned to cast away one other illusion of popular poetry. I learned from the people themselves, before I learned it from any book, that they cannot separate the idea of an art or a craft from the idea of a cult with ancient technicalities and mysteries. They can hardly separate mere learning from witchcraft, and are fond of words and verses that keep half their secret to themselves. Indeed, it is certain that before the counting house had created a new class and a new art without breeding and without ancestry, and set this art and this class between the hut and the castle, and between the hut and the cloister, the art of the people was as closely mingled with the art of the coteries as was the speech of the people that delighted in rhythmical animation, in idiom, in images, in words full of far-off suggestion, with the unchanging speech of the poets. Now I see a new generation in Ireland which discusses Irish literature and history in Young Ireland societies, and societies with newer names, and there are far more than when I was a boy who would make verses for the people. They have the help, too, of a vigorous journalism, and this journalism sometimes urges them to desire the direct logic, the clear rhetoric of popular poetry. It sees that Ireland has no cultivated minority, and it does not see, though it would cast out all English things, that its literary ideal belongs more to England than to other countries. I have hope that the new writers will not fall into its illusion, for they write in Irish, and for a people the counting house has not made forgetful. Among the 700,000 or 800,000 who have had Irish from the cradle, there is perhaps nobody who is not enough of the unwritten tradition to know good verses from bad ones, if he have enough mother wit. Among all that speak English in Australia, in America, in Great Britain, are there many more than the 10,000 the prophet saw, who have enough of the written tradition education has set in room of the unwritten to know good verses from bad ones, even though their mother wit has made them ministers of the crown, or what you will. Nor can things be better till that 10,000 have gone hither and thither to preach their faith, that the imagination is the man himself, and that the world, as imagination, sees it is the durable world, and have won men, as did the disciples of him who his 70 disciples sent against religion and government.